Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
So I understand why people kind of want to, maybe stick their fingers in the ears and go la la la.
Journalism. It's a world of high-pressure deadlines, angry Twitter trolls, and you certainly don't go into it for the money. But I love it. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and welcome to Chopper's Politics. And on today's show, I'm joined by three colleagues who share my passion for our profession, but who are now having to navigate uncharted waters, covering the most unprecedented story of our careers. Well, since the last time anyway. So how do we, the journalists passing you the information, make sure we get it right? And that it isn't all politicians, experts and conspiracies? Well, here with me to discuss everything about covering the coronavirus pandemic are the Telegraph's political editor, Gordon Rayner, our science editor, Sarah Knapton, and our parliamentary sketch writer, Michael Deacon. Now, Gordon Rayner, to you first. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks, Chris.
Good. Now, I've got to ask you a key question that everyone wants to know when you ask your question of the Prime Minister or even Grant Shapps. Do you curate your bookcase?
Well, the only thing I do is I have a quick glance to make sure that there's nothing embarrassing on the bookshelves, that the kids haven't left anything that might compromise me if it was seen on national television. But I don't do anything with the actual books.
Those are your real books. You read those books.
They're not stunt books. They are actual books, some of which I've even read.
And how do you go about asking a question of the Prime Minister via Zoom? Is it complicated?
Well, I think the first time you do it, it's slightly nerve-wracking because you're on TV and you're slightly worried that if you press the wrong button on your computer, you're going to suddenly cut yourself off. And so the first time I did it, it was slightly nerve-wracking. But it's a Zoom call. They do a sort of technical run-through about half an hour before the press conference starts. So they just make sure that everybody is plugged in. They do a microphone check with everybody, and then you sort of sit there and wait for the press conference to start. And it's pretty straightforward. As long as your microphone or your cheap headphones are working, then it's fine.
And Michael Deacon, of course, you're our parliamentary sketch writer. I'm used to seeing you every day in the House of Commons. You've been in and out of Parliament, haven't you?
A couple of weeks ago, I went in for 2 days when they were launching the virtual Parliament, and they put the big screens up and launching that. So I went in to see how that would work, because I wasn't sure whether watching at home would be enough. The live stream they have on the Parliament website, I wasn't sure, whether that would really give the full flavour of the virtual Parliament. So I have gone in there, and it's all extremely socially distanced up in the press gallery. Normally you could fit hundreds of journalists in there, but there are only 16 journalists allowed in the gallery now, and there's police tape everywhere, all this emergency tape to ensure that everyone is sitting at least 2 meters apart. So it's all rigorously policed, and you feel a bit nervous because sometimes as a sketch writer you think, well, I'm going to sit over this side of the balcony, and then after a bit I'll move around to the other side so I can look down at Labour, and then I can look down at the Tories and so on. But here you daren't move because you think, well, I'll have to walk past another person and then I might get told off by the officials. So you just sit, barely daring to breathe, and just sit there quietly for the whole time, and it's over, and then you all file out at once, with plenty of gaps between you. So it's quite eerie in there. You feel quite nervous.
It's odd, isn't it?
It is weird.
And MPs are asking questions both remotely and in the chamber, aren't they? And that can be quite confusing.
It can be,
I remember you describing Peter Bone looming enormously on the screen, just bearing down on you. It's quite an impressive feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, well, because those screens are quite high up. They're at the eye level of the journalists up in the gallery. They're up above the chamber, and so it looks as if you've got the same MP, say it's 4 Peter Bones, and they're all staring at you at once, and but basically like shouting at you, like they're telling you off. Is quite disorienting.
Yeah. And Sarah Knapton, hello to you.
Hello.
You're up in the northeast, of course. Great work covering this crisis because you're the Telegraph science editor. Do you think the scientists have found it comfortable in the spotlight?
It's a good question, actually. I'm not sure, to be honest, because it's not a natural habitat for them. They I think scientists often go into science almost to hide behind their lab desks and publish once in a blue moon and then kind of quietly disappear again. So I think it's a very odd environment for them to sort of suddenly be in front of the camera, all the time, every day. Some are excelling at it and some are struggling, I think. But yeah, I don't think it's a particularly easy thing for them to do. Most of them aren't media trained. And obviously there's lots of rivalries between different institutions and things. So, it's difficult to often know if people are kind of being a bit churlish about results, or if they really do think something's wrong.
They've been pushed there by the government, haven't they? Because the government keeps telling us in the political journalist world that they're following the science. So we then look at the science to find out where they're going, and that puts them under the microscope.
Well, this is it, and they're getting quite cross about that. I mean, we have a media briefing with Patrick Vallance on a Friday afternoon, just a off the record kind of chat as to what's going on. And their sort of gripe every week is that the politicians are saying we're following the science, but the science is saying no, it's up to politicians to be making these decisions. So it's kind of, where's the buck going to stop here? Because if it all goes terribly wrong, will the scientists be blamed, or will the politicians be able to say, well, we just followed the science, and then the scientists will say, well, we said this, but it wasn't followed. So it's going to be interesting when this is all over to see where the buck stops.
That's right. And Gordon Rayner, do you think that's right? Are the politicians getting their excuses in early? They're saying they're really almost pushing people like Patrick Vallance and others out in the forefront, so they'll take the rap when the final inquiry happens, if there is any criticism at the end.
Yeah, I think so. There was a decision taken very early on in Downing Street, partly, I think, by Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, that they would keep hammering home the message that they were following the scientific advice. And that automatically gives them a bit of arm's length from the mistakes, I suppose. They can always blame the advisors. But of course, advisors advise, they don't take decisions. And it's a slightly cowardly game. Ministers need to look at that advice, but they need to also think about, see the whole thing in the round in terms of the economy, other policies that it affects. And I suspect that when it comes to a public inquiry into the response to coronavirus, which will come around rather too soon for Boris Johnson, because it'll happen while he's still Prime Minister, as opposed to the Iraq inquiry, which was post-dated Tony Blair's premiership, I suspect that blaming the scientific advisors just won't wash.
No, well, and it can't wash, I'm sure. You're getting a lot of a hard time in the journalist world, Gordon Rayner, from the public. Do you think it's fair? You're getting piled on for your questions, aren't you, when you ask them?
Well, I think the country has become split yet again. We in normal times we might have a split between Conservative and Labour supporters. During Brexit, we had a split between Leavers and Remainers, and now we've got a split between the lockdowners and the unlockdowners, I suppose you might say. And so whatever we do, just as in normal times, we're never going to please all the people all the time, and there will be a significant chunk of the population that disagrees with us. And it's interesting that the way that the criticism is going now is it falls between people who think we're not asking tough enough questions of the government because they're very cross about the government's response, and almost an equal number of people think we're being too hard on the government and saying, well, there's not that much the government can do. This is a pandemic caused by the Chinese. What do you expect, sort of thing?
It does strike me that people are fighting their own version of the Second World War out there. They see this virus as an enemy, and they're doing their grandfather or their forebears proud. I mean, if you imagine if Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, had to face up to the press while trying to gather the little ships to take on to try and rescue troops from Dunkirk, and the chaos around that, it would have been very difficult to explain how the government's doing daily basis, wouldn't it? And perhaps it's a rod for their own back that they've given us this chance to query them every single day, and they can't really get any fresh air to breathe to work out what's the way forward.
Yes, and I wonder how long. That I suspect there may come a point quite soon where they may decide either to stop doing the daily press conferences or to change the format of those press conferences, because I think they are getting a little bit stale. I think increasingly the same questions are getting asked every time. The same answers or lack of answers are coming back. Interestingly, of course, they've now dropped the graph that we had been shown every day for 7 weeks, showing how Britain was doing in terms of deaths compared with the rest of the world. And I think that's shown very clearly how much the sort of daily press conferences are exposing the government to the sort of scrutiny they're not really used to on a day by day basis, perhaps.
Yes, quite. I mean, it was almost extraordinary that they waited for 7 weeks for that, because we're being told by government experts that other countries don't collect the same data we do, so the comparators are difficult.
Yeah, I mean, they've been saying that, in fairness, the government experts have said that all the way through this, but they still chose to use that graph because at the beginning, it was advantageous to them because it looked as though we were doing better than other countries. And then as soon as it was obvious we were actually doing worse, they suddenly decided to pick their ball up and walk off the pitch.
Yeah. Michael Deacon, Keir Starmer has now done 2 rounds at PMQs with Boris Johnson. How's he doing?
Oh, I think he's doing pretty well. He's a significant upgrade on his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, when it comes to PMQs. Corbyn, generally speaking, he used to rant a lot, and his questions were sometimes felt irrelevant to the key issue of the day, whatever it was that week. And also, he didn't really seem to pay a lot of attention to what the Prime Minister was saying to him in response. He would just look down his piece of paper and ask the next question on the list. I mean, frankly, there were times when I thought, the Prime Minister could just announce his resignation and walk out of the Commons, and Corbyn would just be totally oblivious and just read out the next question, even though there wasn't a Prime Minister to reply to it. Whereas Starmer's much better. Now, of course, he used to be a barrister, so you expect him to be good at asking questions, but he's very good at preparing, and he's very good at listening, and then he bases his next question on the answer he's just received. He does his research. He's always got lots of figures and quotes and piece of government advice taken from government documents that he can cite, and then if it turns out that Johnson, isn't aware of that figure or that piece of government advice, Johnson flounders a bit, and then it makes him look bad, and Starmer holds up his piece of paper saying, look, this is your own government's advice, this is your own government's figure. So he's very, very well briefed, Keir Starmer. He's made a good start.
To what extent would you say that the empty chamber works for Keir Starmer? It feels like the grilling of this hapless opponent, in a kind of like Ironside or Columbo or something, in a courtroom drama.
It's more like a courtroom, because normally at PMQs, any Prime Minister has an advantage because, of course, they have a majority of MPs, and those MPs, all crammed in there, hundreds of them, are all cheering the Prime Minister, whatever he's saying, and they are heckling their opponent, drowning him out, trying to put him off, asking his question. That's very, very helpful. And of course, we don't have that now. You've got a maximum of 50 MPs in the chamber, so there might be only a dozen, maybe a couple of dozen Tories in there. They can't all cheer and shout and jeer because, they just sound ridiculous. So they're all sitting there quite silent. And that makes the Prime Minister look a little bit exposed and lost. And also, he can't turn to a minister and ask them for a, whisper and say, give us a hint. What do I say here? Because there's no one within 2 meters of him. So that they can't whisper in his ear. So he is absolutely on his own there. And so, it does make him look a bit exposed. He doesn't have the advantage that he would normally have with a full chamber.
Yes. Right, stay with me. I'll be talking to our Telegraph experts about trust in the media, science conspiracies, and politicians' haircuts. Right after this.
Go beyond the headlines with the Telegraph's daily coronavirus podcast, a roundup of the latest news on the pandemic from our leading journalists, with analysis on the impact on health, business and travel every weekday evening. Search Coronavirus the Latest on your podcast app.
So Sarah Knapton, do you think the scientists are comfortable by being wheeled out daily to stand next to these politicians? Is it quite an uneasy alliance there?
I think so. I think it's interesting how you've got the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State or whoever's up that day sort of flanked by scientists. It's very much their show in a way, and they're kind of devolving power to either side of them. I think some are doing better than others. Chris Whitty's very good. Patrick Vallance is very good. Some of the others, I think, struggle. But, when you've got someone as sort of clued up as Chris Whitty or Vallance, they're not scared in the same way of politicians are to just tell it how it is, because it kind of doesn't matter to them in the way that it does to politicians. So you'll generally find that you might as well ignore the answers that the politicians are giving at the daily press conference and just listen to the guys either side or the women either side, because they're the ones that have really are actually saying things that will take things further.
And they are giving answers which seem very straightforward, aren't they? They don't seem to be trying to avoid the question. They do try and genuinely, even when it's political journalists asking the questions, they do. I think it's quite refreshing to hear the answers sometimes.
Yeah, and everyone's an expert in this now. I mean, the public have followed this for months now, and so arguably are really clued up. And if you've been watching the press conferences every day, I mean, I don't have children, but if I did, I'd be plonking them in front of the telly as kind of one of their lessons for the day, just to see how, a crisis moves, and from a scientific perspective, and how you look at data and examine data and make decisions based on it. It's been an invaluable lesson, I think, for children and the public. So yeah, I do think it's a good thing. But yeah, I agree with Gordon in the fact that maybe it's wearing a bit thin now, and we are just getting the answers repeated.
But Sarah, of course, science isn't an exact thing, is it? It's based on the evidence you can get. And journalists, we are always trying to make scientists be more exact what they're saying to us, and they can't say that.
Yeah, I agree, that's true. But at the same time, it's sort of showing the nuance in the whole process, really, which I think is helpful. I mean, it's definitely helpful for politicians and policymakers, because the science is changing all the time. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, we're getting probably 50 new scientific papers every day on coronavirus that we're having to wade through. None of it's peer-reviewed, so you have no idea if it's any good. And you've just got to make judgment calls on it. So I think it's kind of helpful to see it all playing out in real time, just so that the public can understand how hard these decisions are to make, and how it's not an exact science, and you can't, you're just literally doing it on an evidence-based day by day, and that's all you can do at the moment.
And of course, Sarah Knapton, on the internet, 5G has been blamed for causing coronavirus. I mean, what can scientific journalists and scientists do to deal with that?
I mean, it's really hard because, for every serious bit of analysis online, there's like 10 bits of nonsense floating around, and the internet's so enormous that there's always another crackpot out there who will believe your theory and disseminate it across the web. And often people want to believe these conspiracy theories more than the truth because it suits an agenda they may be pushing. So it's very hard, and there's limited resources of what you can do to stop that. I think definitely Facebook and Twitter has a big responsibility to get on top of these things. But, it's really out of control. I had a friend who's, very smart. She's very well educated. And she put out something yesterday saying that the government was forcing people to be vaccinated against this, like you would have no choice. And she was saying that the law had been changed after and she'd just seen something on Facebook, some nonsense. And so even intelligent people can be sucked into this and don't kind of question it. So I think it is a problem. And I don't know what you do about it, because I don't think there's a solution at the moment.
I think the world of politics and science has conspired into one story last week with the Neil Ferguson drama, when he resigned from Sage after his girlfriend visited him twice at home. Gordon Rayner, did you feel sorry for Neil Ferguson?
Obviously, there was criticism from some quarters of the fact that a chap who had been sort of dragged into the public eye, if you like, was suddenly the subject of newspaper headlines, and that his personal life was being brought to the fore. But the fact is that he is an incredibly important cog in the machine at the moment. His advice was very much part of the whole reason that the lockdown policy was introduced. We are living through the biggest crisis since the Second World War, and if the people who are taking decisions, or at least helping to inform those decisions, are ignoring the very advice that they are saying it's so vital for the whole country to be following, then I'm afraid they do have to be held up to scrutiny. And I'm afraid Neil Ferguson, to his credit, realised that immediately as soon as he was found out, put his hands up and said, my position is now untenable.
Sarah Knapton, how did scientists react to that? Because, of course, that was almost the inevitable result of politicians saying they're following scientists, and they become the focus. And then poor old Neil Ferguson finds himself being treated like a politician.
Yeah, but in some ways he brought it on himself, didn't he? You can argue. I mean, he was very aware what the advice was. He was very aware that he shouldn't have been doing it. So I don't think the scientific community really had an awful lot of sympathy for him.
Michael Deacon, Professor Lockdown, what's your take on it?
Well, I understand why people say they sympathise with him. And of course, everyone has a personal life. But we're not interested in his personal life for the sake of it. It's not like, with a footballer being caught with a a glamour model or something like that. It's not prurient. This is purely about double standards. Here's the man who gives the advice saying we've got to have lockdown, we've got to obey social distancing rules. Now, if he's not following his own rules, that just undermines them. And that's a problem, because we need people to respect those rules. And if they see that this guy is not doing it, then they might not themselves. So he did the right thing in stepping down.
I think it's worth pointing out as well that if it had been his mum or a mate or anybody who'd been visiting him, that would have still been the story, and he would have still had to step down. I think it's not because it was his girlfriend particularly; it was another person. It just happened that it was his girlfriend.
Yeah, and of course, his defence was he felt he was immune to the disease. Sarah Knapton, is that based in any kind of scientific evidence you've seen?
Well, yes, it is. But I mean, it's just a feeling, wasn't it? As far as I know, you didn't have a serology test. And at the moment, he knows as well as anyone that it's not 100% sure that people even have immunity for coronavirus, even if you get it. He would have known that. I mean, if you get a common cold, that doesn't stop you getting another common cold 6 months down the line. And that's a coronavirus. So we just don't know that yet. So for him to say that, it just felt like a bit of an excuse.
Gordon Rayner, on the issue of trust, which has been raised as we're living this crisis in real time on 24-hour news, the University of Oxford Reuters Institute found that over half of nearly 3,000 people surveyed thought the government was doing a good job, but 25% felt the media was exaggerating the crisis. Are we exaggerating the crisis?
Well, I would certainly hope not. Also, that means that 75% of people think that we're not exaggerating the crisis, if you look at it the other way around. So I would have thought that's not a bad figure, to be honest, given that, traditionally people like to complain about the media anyway. So I think I'd take 75%.
And so, Sarah Knapton, do you worry about the fact the trust issues have been raised about the journalism through this crisis?
I think, if anything, people are starting to trust journalists a bit more through this. I know our people reading our work has hugely gone up since the start of this. So obviously there is an appetite for, proper analysis and news that's coming from a reliable source. So I think, news sources that you can rely on this has proved they've never been more valuable than they are at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a general problem with just the media. I mean, I think it's a problem, isn't it? The serious newspapers often get lumped in with this whole other media landscape when it's just unfair to do that. It's like comparing a crummy B&B somewhere to the Ritz. You can't really do it. But there's this mainstream media kind of trope which is often played out unfairly. So I guess it's where you choose your news source from is whether you'll find it valuable or not. And there's loads of surveys that showed that the paper you read is the one you think is the most trustworthy, right? I mean, obviously, but it goes to show that you generally think the things that you are absorbing are trustworthy. So it's interesting.
Oh yeah, the issue of bias hasn't really reared its head in the same way as last year during the Brexit drama. Michael Deacon, do you think people have had enough news? Are they trying to tune out? The same poll found that 47% of people say they're avoiding the news. Now, Gordon Rayner will say that means that 53% of them aren't, but it still shows that people have maybe had enough news. Let's get some other news to talk about.
Well, I think just because of the nature of the crisis, some of them are just sort of, frightened, so they don't want to hear anymore, or they're extremely fatigued because it's the same story all of the time and it just stresses them out to hear about it and they want to think about something else. And I found that actually with reader responses to my column, because I write 2 columns a day at the moment. I write one, which is the political sketch, which is obviously all about the doom and gloom and the horror. But then I also write another column now in the feature section called Letters from Lockdown. Now that's also about lockdown, obviously, but it's about the lighter side of it. I don't talk about politics at all. I just talk about the sort of mundane, everyday life under lockdown, just homeschooling my 6-year-old son, or growing a lockdown beard, or just going shopping and things like that. I do this, just really mundane, everyday stories that I think people can identify with. And the reader responses, I get that from really good. The emails I get, very often people will say, "Oh, this cheers me up. I'm so sick of all the doom and gloom and all the news reports because it's all really scary." And I like reading something that's actually light and silly. So I think, so I understand it psychologically. When you have a global crisis like this, it's very frightening for people and it's relentless. It's on the news all the time. It's in every page of the paper. It's scary. So I understand why people kind of want to, maybe stick their fingers in the ears and go la la la, because, they want to protect themselves. They're stressed enough as it is.
I've been watching James Bond films at night time to chill out, but it hasn't really worked.
Very good. Very good. I've been reading a lot of Agatha Christie. Yeah.
Just before we wind up, Gordon Rayner, how do you think this crisis will change how you cover politics as we go forward?
Well, I wonder whether we are ever going to get back to a sort of a normal politics in the near future, because interestingly enough, there is now talk of politicians carrying on with this hybrid parliament arrangement for potentially indefinitely, especially MPs who live in the further away places like the Hebrides. And as we reported the other day, they're also talking about shelving the plans to build a temporary parliamentary chamber in order to repair and restore the main building. So I wonder if we are going to get back to a full 650 MPs in Parliament situation anytime soon. And that obviously will change things hugely.
Right, Sarah Knapton, will scientists now be a bit more politically wise before getting dragged into being the front men for these political decisions?
I think they'll always have to be in this situation. I can't imagine even if we had another pandemic, they wouldn't be called up, and they're going to have to get used to it. Yeah, but I think they have stepped into the limelight, and they've done it quite well. So I think we've seen some stars emerging. Especially Chris Whitty's been particularly great.
Yeah.
So is Patrick.
He's a meme, isn't he, on the internet?
He's fantastic, yeah. Very straightforward. You sort of feel like you're in safe hands every time he gets up behind the podium. Yeah, so, since really the beginning of the Trump administration and maybe before that, there's been a real feeling that we didn't trust experts anymore, and that experts had nothing to tell us. And actually what was important was our own impression of the world and our gut instinct. And that was really what's driving society forward. And it's definitely been fueled by this rise in populism. So I think this has actually been very important in almost rehabilitating experts. And I think people have now seen the importance of that level of expertise and training and spending so much time scrutinising one subject, and that it can't just be done from an armchair or from behind a keyboard. So I do actually think that is important.
Yeah, totally. And Michael Deacon, just finally, what does this crisis mean for the future of comedy?
Well, it's not very good for the future of live comedy. I guess the stand-up comedy, you have one man on a stage, but now you can only have one man in the audience as well. But in terms of political satire, it's difficult writing a sketch these days, partly because, global crisis doesn't really lend itself to comedy, but also because it's such a slow-moving story and it's very repetitive. You've got a news conference every day, and you've got the same ministers giving the same answers day after day. It's quite hard to find a different angle each time. Politics is very unvaried at the moment. So, yeah, it's tough. And so I guess, I don't know, I'm going to be writing about ministers' hair for about the next 6 months.
Well, on that note, Gordon Rayner in Berkshire, Sarah Knapton in Newcastle, Michael Deacon in Kent, thank you so much for coming on this edition of Choppers Politics, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was great fun.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, that's it for this week. Thank you to Gordon Rayner, Sarah Knapton, and of course Michael Deacon for taking the time on their very busy day to join me on Choppers Politics. If today's show has shown you that we're not all that bad, you may like to support what we do and take out a Telegraph subscription. You can get 7 days for free, and after that it's just £3 a week by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. Thank you to my producers, Elliot Lampitt, Louisa Wells, and of course Theo Ludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for taking the time to listen. If you enjoyed it, please do me a huge favour and leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Just one kind listener called Andrew265 did that. He thinks the show is always entertaining and enlightening with a great selection of guests. Well, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate it. And don't forget, please do buy your Telegraph if you can, and stay safe. Until next time, cheerio!